The fluorescent lights of Northwood High's auditorium hummed, casting an almost clinical glow on the expectant crowd. I, Maya, sat in the middle row, my heart pounding in my chest. Tonight wasn't about the bake sale fundraisers or the Friday night football games that defined our small Indiana town. Tonight, all eyes were on the stage, where my 9-year-old daughter, Zariah, was about to share a piece of her soul. Zariah, with her small hands that usually flew across the worn keys of a yard sale keyboard, had poured weeks of practice into an original composition. She wasn't just playing notes, she was weaving a story, a melody that felt like rain and loss and the quiet strength of hope. As she finished, her fingers trembling slightly above the final chord, an unsettling silence filled the room. It wasn't the odd silence you might expect, the kind that hangs heavy with emotion. No, this was different. It was a vacuum, a void that seemed to suck the very air from the auditorium. Then, just as the silence threatened to become unbearable, a voice, sharp and cutting, pierced through the stillness. "That's the poor girl," a woman whispered, her words laced with a disdain that hit me like a physical blow. "The one with the single mom." The words weren't directed at me, but they landed squarely on Zariah, on her talent, on her courage. My ears roared, my vision blurred. I wanted to disappear, to shield my daughter from this cruel judgment, but I was frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of shame and fury. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. This wasn't the story I wanted for her, and as a single tear traced a path down Zariah's cheek, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this night, this moment, would change everything. And that's where our story truly begins. A story about a mother's love, a daughter's courage, and the power of a single act of kindness to rewrite a narrative. If you're ready to witness how one night can alter the course of lives, how silence can be broken, and how a young girl found her voice in the most unexpected of ways, then you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe to Life Stories 1 and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The aftermath of Zariah's performance hung in the air, thick and heavy like the humidity of a summer night in Indiana. The fluorescent lights, which had moments before seemed to promise a stage for dreams, now felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the subtle shifts in the room. The whispers, the averted gazes, the cloying smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, they all coalesced into a silent judgment, a verdict passed without a single word spoken. It was a judgment not on Zariah's music, but on the invisible lines that divided our town. Lines drawn with assumptions about where you lived, what car you drove, and how many parents stood beside you at the grocery store. I, Maya, felt the weight of those lines pressing down on me, on Zariah, on the very air I breathed. It was a weight I had carried for most of my life, a constant awareness of being on the periphery of a community that was both welcoming and subtly exclusionary. I worked tirelessly, juggling my janitorial shift at Northwood High during the day with my late-night hours at the Starlight Diner, a classic roadside joint where truckers and teenagers fueled up on greasy fries and cheap coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work that allowed me to provide for Zariah, to put a roof over our heads and food on our table, but it also meant I often missed school events, parent-teacher conferences, the little moments that cemented a sense of belonging. Zariah, my Zariah, was everything to me. She possessed a quiet strength, a gentle spirit that often felt out of sync with the boisterous energy of her peers. She wasn't drawn to the latest trends or the popular crowd. Her world revolved around melodies, around the soulful whispers of music that seemed to emanate from a place deep within her. She'd spend hours lost in her own compositions, her fingers dancing across the keys of the old second-hand keyboard I'd found for her, a keyboard that, despite its missing stand and sticky B-flat key, held a universe of sound for her. The talent show had been Zariah's idea, not a desire for attention, but a yearning to share what I wrote, as she called it. There was a quiet pride in her voice when she filled out the sign-up form, a fragile hope that her music, her story, would resonate. I knew, however, that the stage held more than just musical notes for her. It was a spotlight, exposing her to a scrutiny that went beyond her performance. Her worn but clean shoes, a season behind the latest styles, the brown bag lunch she carried instead of the character-themed lunchboxes her classmates flaunted. These details, these markers of our economic reality, would be on display as well. That night, as I watched Zariah walk onto the stage, her small frame almost swallowed by the vastness of the auditorium, I saw not just a budding musician, but a young girl navigating a complex social landscape. She carried herself with a dignity that belied her years, her chin held high, but her fingers betraying her nervousness as they fidgeted with the hem of her hand-me-down dress, a dress I had painstakingly mended the night before. The silence that followed her performance wasn't just a lack of applause. It was a dismissal, a rejection of her vulnerability, of her offering. It was a stark reminder of the subtle ways in which our society can diminish those who don't fit neatly into its predefined boxes. And in that moment, as I sat paralyzed in my seat, I felt a wave of emotions wash over me, a fierce protectiveness, a burning anger at the injustice of it all, and a profound sense of helplessness. I wanted to scream, to defend her, to shout to the room that Zariah was more than the sum of our circumstances, that her music, her voice, mattered. But the words caught in my throat, trapped by the invisible walls of social expectation and the fear of further exposing us to judgment. The auditorium, a space that had moments before echoed with the stifling silence of indifference, now held its breath, suspended in a moment of bewildered anticipation. All eyes, it seemed, were fixed on the lone figure who had dared to disrupt the carefully orchestrated flow of the evening. He was a study in contrasts to the rest of the room. Where others were adorned in shimmering sequins and pressed suits, he wore a simple, understated gray suit that spoke of quiet confidence rather than ostentatious display. He carried no phone, no device to distract him from the present moment, from the raw, unfiltered emotion that had just unfolded on the stage. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, each step carrying him further into the heart of the auditorium, towards the stage where Zariah stood, a small figure silhouetted against the harsh glare of the spotlights. A ripple of whispers followed in his wake, a hushed chorus of, "Who is that?" and puzzled glances exchanged between parents and judges alike. The air crackled with a sense of the unknown, a feeling that the carefully constructed facade of the talent show, with its emphasis on polished performances and predictable applause, was about to be shattered. My own confusion was laced with a growing sense of unease. I didn't recognize this man. He didn't belong to our small-town social circles, where everyone knew everyone else's business, their triumphs and their struggles. Yet, there was something in his demeanor, in the unwavering steadiness of his gaze, that resonated with a primal instinct within me. A feeling that this man wasn't a threat, but a harbinger of something significant. Something that transcended the petty judgments and social anxieties that had permeated the room. He reached the front of the auditorium and turned to face the judges. His voice, when he finally spoke, cutting through the lingering unease with a calm authority. "Excuse me," he said, the words simple, yet imbued with a quiet power that commanded attention. "Would it be all right if I borrowed the microphone for a moment?" It wasn't a question. Not really. It was a statement, a respectful request that carried the weight of unspoken conviction. The judges, caught off guard, exchanged uneasy glances. The young man in the maroon blazer, who had been so engrossed in his phone just moments before, half rose from his chair, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He seemed unsure of how to respond, of whether to assert his authority or yield to the unspoken command of this unexpected intruder. After a brief silent consultation with his fellow judges, he gave a barely perceptible nod, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge not just the man's request, but also the palpable shift in the atmosphere. A student volunteer, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment, wordlessly handed the man the microphone. He walked slowly to center stage, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he were traversing sacred ground. He turned to face the audience, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, taking in the mixture of curiosity, confusion, and perhaps a flicker of nascent hope that mirrored the emotions swirling within me. "My name is Dr. Elias Monroe," he announced, his voice resonating with a deep, resonant timbre that filled the auditorium. "And I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. My flight home got canceled, so I came to watch my granddaughter perform. But then I heard something that stopped me cold." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, drawing the audience in, compelling them to listen, to truly listen, in a way they hadn't listened before. The silence that followed was no longer awkward or dismissive. It was a silence born of reverence, of a collective recognition that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Dr. Monroe's words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the earlier dismissal. He wasn't offering polite praise. He was delivering a pronouncement, a validation that resonated with the weight of his expertise. "I've spent my life teaching piano at Juilliard," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the audience. "I've trained concert pianists, film composers, symphony soloists, and in all those years, very few pieces have grabbed me the way that little girl's music did just now." The shift in the room was palpable. The earlier unease, the awkwardness, the sense of social obligation that had permeated the atmosphere began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of awe and a dawning realization that they had witnessed something truly special. The hushed whispers now carried a different tone, a mixture of surprise and a hint of shame for their earlier indifference. Dr. Monroe turned his kind eyes towards the side of the stage, where Zariah stood, a fragile figure caught between disbelief and a hesitant hope. "Zariah," he said, his voice softening, "may I ask, did you write that piece yourself?" It was a simple question, yet it carried the weight of profound significance. It was an acknowledgement of her artistry, a recognition that the music they had almost dismissed was not merely a child's recital, but a work of original creation. Zariah, her face still etched with the memory of the earlier rejection, nodded slowly, her eyes darting between Dr. Monroe and me, unsure of whether to allow herself to smile, to embrace this sudden turn of events, or to retreat back into the shadows where she felt safer. Dr. Monroe turned back to the audience, his gaze unwavering, his voice filled with a quiet passion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his words ringing with a conviction that silenced any lingering doubts. "That was an original composition. That was a voice. That was art." A collective gasp swept through the room. The word Juilliard hung in the air, whispered with a reverence usually reserved for hallowed institutions and legendary figures. It was a word that carried the weight of artistic excellence, a benchmark of talent that few could claim. And now, this man, this renowned maestro, was using that word to describe the music of a 9-year-old girl from their small town. "I'd like to ask a favor," Dr. Monroe continued, his gaze softening as he looked back at Zariah. "With your permission, Zariah, would you be willing to play your piece again? This time, may I accompany you?" My breath caught in my throat. The audacity of the request, the sheer generosity of the offer, left me speechless. It was a moment of profound grace, a gesture that transcended mere encouragement. It was an invitation to collaborate, to elevate, to give Zariah's music the platform it deserved. Zariah's eyes flickered towards me, a silent plea for guidance, for permission to step back into the spotlight, to trust this stranger who had so unexpectedly become her champion. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage, a gesture that conveyed all the unspoken emotions that threatened to overwhelm me, the pride, the gratitude, the overwhelming relief that someone, finally, saw what I saw in my daughter. Zariah, her small shoulders still carrying the weight of the earlier silence, hesitated for a fleeting moment. It was a hesitation born not of fear, but of a profound sense of awe, of grappling with the magnitude of what was being offered to her. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that mirrored Dr. Monroe's own, she walked back onto the stage. Each step she took seemed to shed another layer of the vulnerability that had clung to her just moments before. Dr. Monroe, with an almost reverent gesture, stepped aside, allowing Zariah to take her place at the piano first. He didn't claim the bench as his own, but rather shared it, a subtle act of deference that spoke volumes about his respect for her artistry. His hands hovered above the keys, poised and waiting, not to dominate, but to listen, to respond, to become a vessel for her melody. And then she began to play. The notes that emerged this time were different. They were no longer small, tentative whispers, but resonant declarations, filled with a newfound confidence and a quiet strength. Dr. Monroe's accompaniment was not an intrusion, but an embrace. His chords, subtle and supportive, wove themselves around Zariah's melody, lifting it, carrying it, giving it a depth and richness it had never possessed before. It was as if her music had found its true voice, a voice that had been waiting to echo, to harmonize, to soar. You could feel the shift in the room, a tangible transformation that transcended the mere act of listening. The earlier restlessness, the whispers and fidgeting, vanished, replaced by an almost palpable stillness. Parents leaned forward in their seats, their faces etched with a mixture of wonder and regret for their earlier distraction. The judges, who had been so preoccupied with their clipboards and phones, now sat transfixed, their pens abandoned, their eyes wide with a dawning realization of the talent they had almost overlooked. The music flowed, a conversation between a young girl's heart and a maestro's soul. It was a conversation that spoke of resilience, of hope, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. It was a story told not in words, but in the language of emotion, a language that transcended age, background, and social standing. When they reached the final note, a sustained chord that hung in the air, pregnant with unspoken meaning, there was a beat of perfect stillness. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a release of the tension that had gripped the auditorium since Zariah's first solitary performance. And then, the silence shattered. The applause erupted like a tidal wave, a force of nature unleashed. Shouts and whistles filled the air, hands clapping with a raw, unbridled energy that shook the very foundations of the auditorium. People who had barely noticed Zariah before were now on their feet, their faces flushed with emotion, their phones held aloft, capturing the moment as if they had just witnessed a miracle. The applause continued to surge, a wave of sound washing over Zariah and Dr. Monroe as they stood on the stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight. It was a sound that had been absent just moments before, a sound that Zariah had so desperately craved, and now it seemed to have no end. I stood in the crowd, my own hands stinging from the force of my clapping, tears streaming down my face, blurring the scene before me. But through the blur, I saw Zariah. She wasn't the poor girl anymore. She was a musician, an artist, a storyteller who had moved a room full of people to their feet. She stood tall, her shoulders back, her head held high, a stark contrast to the hunched figure she had been when she walked off the stage after her first solitary performance. She turned to Dr. Monroe, and I saw a smile blossom on her face, a smile that radiated not just relief, but a deep, genuine joy, a smile that spoke of a connection forged through music, a shared understanding that transcended words. It was the most beautiful, sincere smile I had ever seen. When the applause finally began to subside, Zariah didn't rush off the stage, eager to escape the lingering awkwardness. Instead, she stood there, her hands resting gently in her lap, her eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. She looked around the auditorium as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the faces of the people who had, just moments ago, seemed so distant and indifferent. There was no fear in her gaze now, only a quiet amazement at the transformation that had taken place, at the power of her music to bridge the divides that had separated her from them. Dr. Monroe leaned towards her, his lips close to her ear, and said something that the rest of us couldn't hear. Zariah listened intently, her expression thoughtful, and then she nodded once, a small, decisive movement that conveyed her acceptance, her understanding of the significance of his words. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stood, and for the second time that night, she bowed, But this time, the gesture was different. It was no longer timid, hesitant, a mere formality. It was proud, intentional, a claiming of her space, a recognition of her own worth. She looked up, her chin held high, her gaze sweeping across the room, and the room, in turn, gave her everything it hadn't the first time. Its undivided attention, its heartfelt appreciation, its unreserved admiration. As Zariah and Dr. Monroe walked off the stage together, a palpable buzz of excitement filled the auditorium. People turned to each other, their voices filled with a newfound curiosity, asking who she was, where she came from. Parents who had barely acknowledged our existence in the school pickup line were now craning their necks to get a better look at her, their faces etched with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Kids whispered in awe, their eyes wide with a dawning realization that talent could emerge from the most unexpected of places. Even one of the judges, the one with the oversized blazer and the perpetually unimpressed demeanor, followed them backstage with a clipboard, a genuine smile on his face, as if he had just stumbled upon a hidden treasure. I stood in the crowd, the echoes of the applause still ringing in my ears, my heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. The scene unfolding before me felt surreal, like a dream I hadn't dared to have, a reality I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. Just moments ago, Zariah had been the poor girl, an invisible presence in the social hierarchy of our small town. Now, she was the center of attention, the subject of admiration, the catalyst for a transformation that extended far beyond the stage. When Zariah finally came down from the stage, her face glowing with a newfound confidence, she ran straight into my arms. "I did it," she whispered into my chest, her voice filled with a quiet triumph that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't speak. Words seemed inadequate to express the overwhelming joy and relief that washed over me. I simply held her tighter, burying my face in her hair, inhaling the sweet scent of childhood, and the even sweeter aroma of a dream realized. Dr. Monroe approached us a moment later, his smile warm and genuine. He extended his hand to me, but before I could take it, he spoke, his voice filled with a quiet authority that commanded respect. "Your daughter has an extraordinary gift," he said, his gaze fixed on Zariah. "One I don't see often. That was more than just talent. That was truth." He paused, his eyes meeting mine, conveying a depth of emotion that transcended mere politeness. "I finally found my voice," he continued, his words thick with a gratitude that humbled me. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing her, for giving her that moment." I shook my head, my voice choked with emotion. "It wasn't mine to give," I managed to say, my gaze shifting to Zariah, who stood beside me, her hand resting gently in mine. "She created it all. I just made sure no one missed it." Dr. Monroe nodded, a knowing smile gracing his lips. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a card. It was embossed with his name and a New York address, a tangible symbol of the world that was now opening up to Zariah, a world that had once seemed so distant and unattainable. "If you're open to it," he said, his voice filled with a quiet hope, "I'd like to connect her with someone at a youth arts foundation I work with. They offer weekend intensives and private mentorship for gifted young composers. She won't have to audition. I already heard what I needed to hear." I was stunned. The offer was beyond anything I could have imagined, a lifeline thrown to us from a world I had only glimpsed from afar. I looked down at the card, the elegant lettering a stark contrast to the worn edges of my calloused hands, and then back at Dr. Monroe, his face radiating a genuine desire to help. "She's never taken a formal lesson," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we can't really afford much right now." He smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile that put me at ease. "That won't be a problem," he said, his gaze shifting to Zariah, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "This is about access. She deserves to be nurtured, not just noticed." Zariah looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, a silent question hanging in the air. It was a question that went beyond the logistics of weekend trips and music lessons. It was a question about whether she was worthy of this opportunity, whether she dared to believe that her dreams could actually come true. I nodded, my own tears threatening to spill over, a silent assurance that I would do everything in my power to make this happen, to support her every step of the way. "Thank you," Zariah whispered, her voice small but steady, filled with a gratitude that resonated far beyond her years. "Thank you. Thank you," Dr. Monroe simply tipped his head, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, and then turned and walked back towards the crowd, leaving behind him a ripple of awe and wonder, a sense that something truly extraordinary had transpired.